little less than a month ago, a little town in St. Louis County by the name of Ferguson, Missouri, population 21,000, suddenly became one of those places where you merely mention one word, the name of Ferguson, and everybody knows what you're talking about and everybody knows where it is. We have with us this morning two people who were there covering the events at Ferguson, and we have another person who represents those of us who are in the press trying to cover things like that. We're going to be talking a little bit about the challenges of covering an event such as that, the challenges that the people faced on the ground who were there, as well as some of the situations that existed before and after, perhaps. The press has taken some hard knocks from some people who were critical of the way that we covered the event. You see here an editorial cartoon, the original of which I have here. And it's a signed copy, numbered, limited edition. And if anybody from SPJ would like to put this in your auction for the Legal Defense Fund, your live auction or whatever afterwards, come up and see me and I'll be glad to donate it to you. But this is one example of some of the criticism we took. There was criticism of the media for not doing a good job of properly portraying and properly putting things in context in Ferguson. But at the same time, there were people who were on the ground who were doing the best they can. I talked to the teacher of the year in Missouri just a few days ago, who is a journalism teacher at Hazelwood West High School in St. Louis County. A journalism teacher is the teacher of the year in Missouri. And I called him and I said, I'm sure that you gained a lot of important things to teach your journalism students because of the Ferguson experience. And he told me that he'd gone to Ferguson on the first night of the demonstrations, that Sunday evening, so that he'd have something to talk about in his classroom the next day in terms of ethically and compassionately reporting a story such as this. And when things got violent, he decided he'd better get out of there, and he headed back to his car. Unfortunately, in order to get back to his car, he had to walk past the Quick Trip that was being pillaged, looted, and burned. And he was hit in the side of the head with a brick. It took 6 stitches to close his wound, and he spent 5.5 hours at a police outpost until it was safe for him to go get his car and go home. But he taught his class the next day. And he has had some interesting observations to make about how we performed, the media, print, broadcast, online, in Ferguson. And maybe I'll share some of those with you a little bit later. They are included in some handouts that we have. We made about 30 packages of handouts that are over here. If we run out before you get yours, we're going to be posting that material on the internet, on the RTDA internet, so that you can go find it after the convention. Our 3 panelists this morning. We have 2 people, as I said, who were on the ground in Ferguson. We're going to start out with Robert Brooks, who is the online editor of Radio 1 in New York. He is the middle person here. Next to me is Elise who was with NPR, who tweeted, was it a tweet? Your first gassing? And a lot of other first experiences. And then we have Greg Leslie, who is the Legal Defense Director for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. Let's start out by having these 2 folks relate to you a little bit about what it was like to try to cover this event. I guess, and one of the challenges would be how to stay out of the way while doing the things that you had to do. So, Elise, why don't you start things off for us and explain to us how you tried to cover this for NPR without injury to yourself, but also to provide an accurate picture of what was happening.
Sure. First of all, a lot of people ask what I was doing in Ferguson in the first place, because my beat is technology and culture, and usually I'm hanging out in Silicon Valley and whatnot. But I was born in St. Louis County and am a Mizzou grad, a proud Mizzou grad. And so when I saw a lot of this unfold, I just raised my hand and volunteered, hoping that I could offer some understanding and context of St. Louis. Because what was happening in those early days was, and a lot of experiences of big news stories are like this, what was happening was something that was very three-dimensional was getting flattened. And so what I thought was important was to try and get to the other parts of the county and the town and really illuminate what was happening from other parts. Because the truth is, on the ground, a lot of the images that we were playing on cable news all the time were happening in a very limited zone of West Florissant Avenue. And so it was probably about 3 blocks, 3 large city blocks. And the command center, which you could walk to, was by day a Schnucks grocery store, for those of you from St. Louis. It was a Rainbow clothing store. It was a Target. And by day, you know, we were hanging out in the Starbucks inside the Target. And it was very normal, and getting lunch at Sonic. And it was just this every suburb USA experience. And it was after nightfall, you know, especially those nights of the curfew after Governor Jay Nixon started the curfew, that things really got a little dicey. And again, this was happening in a very small zone. And so what was the images that were being broadcast to the world didn't represent all of sort of the entirety of St. Louis or the entirety of even Ferguson, because the brew pubs and the wineries were all still open and everything was going fine. And so there was a charge to sort of make three-dimensional something that was getting flattened. And then there was a really big difference between day and night. At night, what was dangerous was that there were a few bad actors, you know, a few protesters who clearly wanted to challenge the police for numerous reasons. The reason I ended up in a more dicey situation was actually because when I was taking cover in a car wash that was across the street from the Quick Trip, I wasn't sure that anything was actually going to happen that night. It was probably, I think that I had gotten gassed on the final night of tear gassing. And what had happened was police could not tell the difference between press and protesters. And they, in fact, tried to get us to separate from the protesters. There was the bullhorn cop, and Robert, you can probably speak to this. The bullhorn cop for hours had been saying, you know, please disperse. You are failing to disperse. Please disperse. And then he kind of got funny, too, because people were pulling yield signs out, like street signs out of the ground, and he was like, please put the street sign back in the ground. Please return the street sign. And so it had actually kind of gotten to just be a really calm standoff. But these things, it goes from calm to chaos just in a flash. And so what happened, this happened night after night, this calm to chaos, everything just went nuts. And the night I was out there, some rocks were thrown, apparently bottles of urine were thrown and hit the tactical units. And then then you heard, there's a sound that you hear right before the gassing, and you heard a couple pops, and the first blast of gas happened. People and Molotov cocktails were being thrown in the other direction. It was kind of a mess. And then the rest of the press got pushed back, and I jumped into some locals, a vehicle, that there were locals who, before sundown, if you are in the perimeter, that 2-3 block perimeter, you don't get barricaded out, right? You get stuck inside. And some locals had gotten stuck inside, and I just jumped into a car, this car wash, and got stuck. But you can, and so there were
who is out in the crowd as well. He joins us by phone. Steve, what are you seeing?
Don, this is an extremely tense situation that has elevated to the level of what we saw last night with tear gas and smoke being blown. We are down about a quarter mile away from where you've been broadcasting, down by the Ferguson Mart. We're up by the QT gas station, where we had seen a lot of activity here through the days when the riot police pushed back protesters up the avenue. A lot of young people gathered here and were out in the street. Armored personnel carriers and SWAT units, the riot police have been out here for the better part of an hour now in a standoff with people. There were young people, protesters, defying orders to clear the street. There were repeated orders to clear the street. Some of them had taken out street signs that said, do not enter and yield, and were waving them out defiantly in front of the police officers, ignoring their orders to clear the street. And ever since then, we're watching a tactical unit going in now.
Tactical unit that came in on
there are journalists in there. There are journalists in there. I'm sorry, a tactical unit was going in towards the car wash where some journalists sought safety. And the reason we're all hunkered down behind a concrete wall here is because moments ago
my perspective was completely different, because we were blasted by a spotlight, and then these guys with long, I guess they were shotguns, and masks on their faces were coming at us, and it was impossible to see because of the gas still wafting in the air. And then in order to get out of the car wash,
the unmistakable sound of gunshots.
I had to roll down the window,
everybody took defensive positions, and we're all safe. I need to stress that we are safe right now. The police know where we are.
Eventually they let us out, and thanks to Steve Kastenbaum for calling them off too. And so, and I only say all of this just to describe the fact that it was chaotic, and there was nothing, I think, a lot of these cops were operating from a position of defensiveness and in some cases fear, and so that was dangerous for everybody, and journalists included. And in these kinds of situations, when we were mixing, it was really impossible for them to tell who was who.
Thank you. Let's move on now to Robert Brooks, who is with Radio 1 in New York. You were also right in the middle of all of this.
Yeah, and to kind of clarify with Radio 1, I represent Radio 1 as a entity also encompasses an organization called Interactive One, as well as TV One and a few syndication programs. Specifically, I work out with Interactive One, and they're based out of New York. I'm physically based down in St. Louis and also oversee the Dallas market. And the situation with Ferguson, as she stated, it was very different, to say the least. And I summarize it in that way because no one expected anything like that. And from everyone I've talked to who lives in St. Louis, who have lived in St. Louis for a number of years, or from St. Louis, period, completely brand new, the situation. When it took place from my perspective, the radio station was already giving out news to the community on a regular basis about what was taking place. And I was working with Interactive One directly in terms of trying to figure out how we're going to do coverage from a national level as well as a local level to provide content for all of our different platforms and so forth. And the situation, as she mentioned, it escalated quickly. It would go from literally being absolutely calm to all of a sudden it was just complete chaos. So during the day, you knew that things would probably be pretty calm and everyone could kind of walk around, but it was usually around midnight. Is usually when everything really started to take place and kind of just go array. Outside the Ferguson area, which really was, when the situation was taking place, was really like 2 or 3 blocks. That's absolutely correct. There was like other things taking place within the entire scope of the city, but not to the level that it was kind of being promoted out there. So as I was talking to actually a couple, one of my bosses who's here and one of my coworkers who's here too, about it. And I mean, I was getting calls from friends in New York and LA, and they're like, man, are you okay? It's looking like it's the purge. And it's like, no, it's not the purge, but like the tension was definitely there from the perspective that, and it's very key, like, in my personal opinion, when it comes to like how some of the things were handled, is to realize that Missouri is a conceal and carry state. And so around the time this started taking place, you were hearing a lot about, in fact, one of my friends who was he's a very proud like gun owner, to say the least, how they were having issues where like gun stores were, selling out of different pieces of equipment. There were individuals outright who were just waiting for something to happen, plain and simple, hoping something would happen. And so there was a certain level of fear that was literally in the city, particularly in the first week, that something else was just going to happen that was already escalating, but all it's going to take is one thing that's to drop, and it was going to be all chaos. And it was just a looming, feeling. And so from a media standpoint, for us, from the Radio 1 side, our main thing was to come in from an angle that allowed to show, okay, yes, these things are taking place, but here's the other stories that are not taking place. These are the things that are taking place behind the scenes to kind of, diffuse what is going on, to kind of, in terms of trying to help the community and so forth. On my personal side, like I am also a member of 100 Black Men, and 100 Black Men, the organization, was very actively involved behind the scenes in terms of what was going on. So there was certain information that I knew about before it was being released. And as I heard about them, I was like, okay, we need to kind of be ready for this. And so I would communicate that with Gordon Hurd, who was the News One head up in Interactive One. and we would figure out like a game plan or work with the organization, because in fact we got a partnership with them in relation to this to get exclusive information or to get us access to people. I would say probably my biggest strategy when it came to covering the content was taking advantage of the fact that I was on the ground and that the team that I was able to put together was from the city. And that was a very big deal for anyone who knows St. Louis in particular. St. Louis is very much a city where if you're not from there, you're going to have some challenges. You know, if you don't even acknowledge the fact you're not from there and you try to act like you are, they're going to know, and you're going to have some challenges on top of that. If you cannot tell them what high school you were from, and that high school you were from is not from St. Louis, you're going to have challenges. You know, and that's just being honest. They don't care about your college. They don't care if you went to college. What high school did you go to? Plain and simple. I had that problem when I first moved there. So knowing that and having that understanding, you know, when we did put together a team, you know, one of my biggest pushes was that, okay, we need to get local individuals who have relationships and contacts within the city already, you know, who not only are professional and have the experience, but, you know, if they'll just know who to go to, or in fact they may be reached out to some of the individuals that we want to talk to. They may just be able to go to them directly, you know, versus getting certain runarounds that other individuals did run into. So, you know, that was a very big part of our strategy, and that's why we were able to get certain interactions that took place, and we were able to get access to certain content that we were able to have. So that did, in lieu of that too, that also had an effect on, you know, the amount of, I would say, conflict we ran into when it came to like the law enforcement, when it came to getting media coverage, because we were able to leverage some of those relationships to have a smoother line of contact to get certain information than maybe some other journalists did, you know. So that's all I have to say.
Now, at an early point in these demonstrations, there were confrontations that developed between the local authorities and the reporters. And probably one of the most frightening ones that maybe all of you have seen is the image of the reporters who were in the McDonald's the night that the Ferguson police, dressed in combat attire, decided they wanted to clear the place out. And that was pretty scary to see. Very quickly, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press got involved because they could see that there were some things going on in Ferguson that were not in keeping with the constitutional rights that reporters have to report events and incidents. And this is where Greg Leslie got involved. And the Reporters Committee started notifying the folks in the St. Louis area that this simply was an intolerable situation. But Greg, would you like to tell us how you got involved, first of all, in watching what was going on, and then how the Reporters Committee started to try to influence what was happening with the police?
Okay, well, the Reporters Committee, I don't think I can move this closer.
Yeah, go ahead and move.
Hopefully everybody can hear me. No? Is there a longer cord?
You can have ours.
Well, the Reporters Committee watches for incidents like this. That's one of the things we do. We were founded in 1970 by reporters specifically to defend reporters' rights. So part of our role is to look for cases like this of police interference or any kind of official interference with reporters trying to do their jobs. So as soon as we started hearing things, you know, we would get calls from people saying it was getting out of hand. We started to get word from the individuals in the McDonald's incidents, especially the Washington Post and Huffington Post reporter. We were kind of hearing through their attorneys that something was going on. As you can imagine, at a time like that, it's hard to get anything official done because police and county and city police were overruling each other, not really knowing who was in charge. Then the State Highway Patrol came in, and then the National Guard came in. So I think they were busy 24 hours just trying to figure out for themselves how to manage the situation, and they weren't really willing to talk about the media issues because they had a much bigger issue to deal with, you know, which the constant protests and all that they saw over a a serious civil rights issue. So the media issue became very secondary for them, and yet, if you stop the media from covering an important civil rights issue, you really affect how the people understand this civil rights issue. So, some people were saying to us, well, the media concern isn't important right now, let's worry about the bigger concerns, but it is important. Coverage matters, and release of information from police and other state agencies matters at times like this. I think we're going to see more in the coming weeks from the police about the officer's, his version of what happened in this shooting. And it's going to lack a lot of credibility because they didn't get it out quickly. I don't know what it's going to say, but the point is, the longer you wait to get your information out, the more it looks like you're massaging it, playing it up to make it look, to put things in the best perspective for your officers. There was just a real lack of information right at the start, and clamping down on the media or making them feel like they might be arrested just for covering this story really just exacerbates that whole problem. So, we were really pushing for more information to come out and for an opportunity to talk to police about how they were handling the media. And when you look at these issues, if you want to look at how police and the press and protesters interact, you really have to look at two different time periods: pre 9/11 and post 9/11. And everything was different back then. It was a different time, really. As we saw, something that's really starting to get good coverage now is this idea of the militarization of police. And it's frightening. It used to be very rare for a SWAT team to use these tactical maneuvers to stop a sniper or to stop, something really aggressive going on. But now it becomes their default way of handling protesters. And we saw it in Washington, D.C. years ago, right after 9/11, where suddenly these, fully battle-ready police officers were marching on crowds, and they just believed they had to control the situation first and foremost. So if you were on one street, they wanted you on the next block, and they would have tactics as to form a wall and move protesters and move the press. And then to pick up on Elise's point about how they were kind of just confusing the protesters and the press, well, that's going to happen more and more often. Because as we all know, the definition of who is a reporter is not all that clear. And in a case like this, where you're covering civil rights, and the first question is, the issue is a police officer who shot an unarmed person, the media coverage doesn't look all that different from the activist coverage. And activists are not often acting like journalists. Sometimes they want to get arrested as a civil disobedience measure. Other times they're acting more from passion than from trying to cover this for other people. So there's going to be this kind of constant conflict over who is really a reporter, and how do you distinguish the reporters from the activists? And again, going back pre 9/11, this was fairly easy. You kind of knew who the media was, and police actually used to respect the idea of a press pass. And you just don't see that as much anymore. In a protest 15 years ago, if you had your credentials, you would probably not get arrested in the first place, but you could probably also walk right up to police and say, I'm covering this, and you could go behind police lines. If they were arresting people for being in the street when they should be on the sidewalk, you could have probably walked around behind the officers to get the better photograph of what was going on. You can't do that anymore. They don't care if you're a reporter for the New York Times or Washington Post or anything else. If you have no different rights. And, it's worth pointing out that's the issue was that they used to respect the idea of a press pass because they knew who the media was and what the media's role is. It wasn't that police recognized a reporter's right to that kind of coverage. It wasn't as if they said, we understand that your First Amendment rights are implicated here, so we're going to work with you. so we're going to do what we have to. There was just an easier relationship then. So with that being made more difficult, we do have to turn to the issue of, what right do you have to cover a police action? And that question is settled by a judge once this all comes before them, and judges are incredibly deferential to law enforcement during the middle of an emergency. So the thing we have to, the only remedy really, if you're saying it's a First Amendment violation, the only remedy really is a federal civil rights suit, and those are very difficult to bring. But all the factors are there in this kind of incident to lead to a good civil rights claim, but you need the evidence. You need to show how you were injured. You need to show how your rights were interfered with in a substantial and meaningful way to show that you were damaged sufficiently to justify a federal claim. I say that's very difficult to do because you have to show that the officer knew of this right at the time he violated it. Otherwise, they have qualified immunity. So it's very difficult to do, but in a lot of these cases, particularly the old cases revolving around political conventions where reporters would get swept up with protesters, there have been civil rights suits after the fact. They're called, the Section 1983 civil rights suit for a state actor violating your constitutional rights. They have been brought after some of these big protests, and police usually lose that first battle to say that they're immune from these kind of suits, and so once that happens, the jurisdictions enter into settlement talks, and there have been some judgments because of that. And so, in a sense, our best way to assert the rights to report in the future will be to kind of gently suggest that if we don't get cooperation from the police, down the road there will be a civil rights judgment against them. It's a hammer to hit them with when sometimes you want something much more subtle, and it really starts to affect your ability to negotiate with police if they think you're threatening something significant after the fact rather than trying to work with them slowly. So what we do in these situations, is try to work with them during the crisis, and just to avoid that, having to take that second step of saying we're going to file a civil rights suit. So once we were hearing about this, once we were hearing from reporters who actually were stopped from covering things, we got 48 news groups, and you can see the list of them on our website under our briefs and comments sections. The protest letter is up there that went to the key people at each police agency as well as to Eric Holder. We got that 48 group coalition together and sent a letter saying, we have to look into these issues. You have to do something about it now, not after the fact. After the fact, all you're talking about is monetary damages for a civil rights violation. We really wanted to say first, we've got to come up with a way to allow the media to cover this, because when you're talking about a fundamental issue like this, a police shooting of an unarmed person, getting the information out there matters for both sides, no matter what your opinion is on what really happened. The best solution is always getting the information to the public, and so that's what we were pushing for. As I said, unfortunately, the bad news is because this was in the heat of battle, while we did all this, we just didn't get a response to that letter. But we just heard of fewer and fewer incidents, and then, of course, the actual military tactics seemed to also abate.
It seemed to me, watching from Jefferson City, 120 miles away, that when these 48 groups raised these concerns, that's about the same time that the Ferguson police were taken off the case and the Highway Patrol and National Guard moved in, and the climate seemed to improve a little bit. Now, I've seen that from a distance. Do you think, Greg, that kind of happened?
Things changed every day in that first week, really. So obviously, when the city police, I don't think there's a city police out there that's really ready to handle a situation like this. And I don't mean that as an insult. This is just so unusual. So county police can be an improvement. And then, obviously, in this case, the State Highway Patrol being headed by an African American, that made a difference. He came in and engaged with the community and talked to people. He didn't put on battle gear and try to enforce from a position of power. So I think that really made the biggest difference, it seems to me.
Which isn't to say there were no bad actors. I mean, after that first week and after Captain Johnson came in, there were still plenty of incidents, like individual incidents. The Getty Images photographer who was arrested more than a week after Michael Brown was shot, that was happening, after the curfew was lifted or the day the curfew was lifted. And so there were still incidents, and then there was the famous cop who has now resigned or been asked to leave, who said something like, go F yourself or whatever to reporters, and it was caught on tape. And so I will say that while I did think that they showed a lot of restraint as a whole, there were lots of jurisdictions acting at once, right? Not only the ones you mentioned. St. Louis, for those of you guys who really know St. Louis or Missouri, St. Louis has from one block to another, you're in a new suburb, right, or a new town. And so there was Wildwood police there and Fulton police there, and everybody was helping in some way because there was so much traffic management too, just to keep the barricades and keep people from getting close to the zone. And so it seemed as if they were trying out a different strategy every night, and I'm not sure. I'd love to know how all of these different agencies communicated with one another and how, they were instructing a lot of these officers who were manning the barricades to deal with media. My experience was pretty tame. I actually have sound I recorded as we were encountering one of the barricades, just so you guys get an idea that, it's true, not all the cops were really aggressive. They were trying to just follow orders, really. Let's see.
No, ma'am.
The protesters.
Ma'am, I was very clear.
We're just going to please go back the other way. We were told no more pedestrian traffic than I do this. We're just doing what we're told.
But there's media on the sidewalk.
We're just doing it.
I can't help it. I understand that.
They were here early, I guess.
No matter who.
So please go that way. That way or that way?
And you can go that way. And we've had quite a few media go that way.
We
just cannot allow you, for your safety, to go that way. Okay?
So you hear that a lot, for your safety, and we cannot guarantee your safety, and therefore you cannot cross here. They were just told by their superiors that they couldn't let people pass the barricades if you weren't already inside at a certain amount of time. That was me and a New York Times photographer as we were encountering it at 11:30 the night of the last gassing, and at that point, the only way to get through, you heard him say, you can go that way or that way. That way, the other that way, was behind and through the neighborhood streets. So they were actually trying to sort of, with a wink and a nod, say, if you really want to get in there, we're going to turn a blind eye to you going a back way to get in there. And so that was actually kind of doing us a solid, I thought. And maybe that was an individual decision, police officer by police officer, but it was also dangerous because when we did go the back way, we came out in front of the media pens, if you will. So they started creating media zones where press had to be, and that's where a lot of the network cameras were because they were streaming a lot of this live, and they were already sort of fenced off. And if you went the back way, you came out in front of it, in between the protests, and so it was more dangerous. And they kind of indicated that, but again, this was my experience. My experience is not, representative of everybody's, and that's kind of the thing that I keep emphasizing with all of these Ferguson stories.
Robert, is this,
yeah, go ahead.
This kind of thing that you said?
No,
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to make a quick note about that there are really two states, California and Ohio, that have laws saying a police officer can't stop a journalist for his or her own safety. And we need more of those, because really that is what cops say all the time. I'm doing this for you. Well, no, I want to report the story. So,
Robert, did you see the kind of similar experience that Elise had?
Yeah, from my side, I kind of was in the middle, to say the least. I saw the positives and negatives on both sides when it came to all sides, period. When I say all sides, I'm referring to the law, the media, and the protesters. I heard them from all of them, and it was my situation was kind of unique in that case because, as a result of me having to serve as a point person for on a national level for the company I was with, I had to hear what's going on from the national side. Being in a radio station, we had people calling in, expressing their frustrations about what was going on. From the connections I had within the city with the different organizations, I was getting information about what was going on behind the scenes about what was taking place. And then from the contractors that we had out there, they were telling me what they were experiencing, what they were going through. And one of the things, and I definitely agree with in terms of the safety of the media, it was a very important ordeal, not just from the cop standpoint, but I do know of at least one case, because I believe my reporter saw it, where there were some reporters that are out in the Ferguson area who I think things started to get really kind of hot, and they tried to go into their car, and a group of protesters literally jumped in their car and then blocked them from their car and said, "No, you can't go into your car. You have to stay here. We want you to record this." And it's like they're trying to get out the way, and they literally were being blocked not by the police but by the protesters or some members of the protesters or who called themselves the protesters in that case from being able to actually get away from a more dangerous situation. And the biggest challenge that I personally saw and I had when it came to covering this was having verifiable information overall. Oh, no problem. Having verifiable information overall, because you had situations where things were being reported. Some things were hearsay. Some things were, they came from verifiable sources, but they didn't want to speak. In other cases, there was an example like right towards the end where there was a safe house that got raided. And it was interesting because I had on our team a blogger who also is very prominent in social media. And so we were, like myself, the social media point person locally as well as the point person nationally, named Jada Gomez. We were all going back and forth regarding about some of the coverage and content that was going on. And there was just a report that went over the national news that a safe house had just been raided by the cops, which nothing was taking place, but it was like an area where the protesters were just kind of based at, and they just went in there and raided it. And so we're hearing this thing over the news, and they're like, "Man, do you think we can do something about it?" and blah blah blah. And we're going back and forth, and all of a sudden, like the blogger who's actually on the same thread, it's like, "Yeah, I'm actually talking to the protesters right now who just got kicked out the safe house," and I'm like, "Wait a minute, hold on, like can you get them to speak to us? Like, can we get a video interview with them?" And at first they were like, "Yeah, we'll do it." And then next thing you know, just start dwindling. And before you know it, they didn't want to talk. And then the last you hear is that one of them was nervous because she had to go back to her house, and they're literally, at least per her statement, that there was like a cop based outside of her house who was really just watching her to make sure she didn't leave. And so she was just like, "No, I'm not saying anything whatsoever." And so, you ran into those situations where just people just got very scared, to report. And so you may have a very solid story or a very good story to follow up on, but, you wanted to make sure that it was something that was verifiable, something that, that people would not back out of afterwards or say "Well, I heard from so-and-so this is what happened," and so that was a very, very big challenge, which is like that fear factor, because it was all over the city.
There's a couple of things that I need to mention at this point. We tried very hard to get Captain Ron Johnson to be with us on Skype, and we couldn't get him. He is still on duty in Ferguson. They still consider Ferguson to be a very nervous area, and so he is paying close attention to that community, and he is still walking the streets and talking to people there, and he didn't feel like he could be with us given the fluidity of that situation that is continuing to go on in Ferguson, especially as we have a grand jury that now is meeting and some other things that are happening within the community that are kind of bubbling under the surface. I talked to the spokesman for the Department of Public Safety. Our highway patrol in Missouri is part of DPS. Mike O'Connell is his name, and he's a former reporter from Nashville here and from St. Louis. And I asked him what kinds of things was the captain saying. He said there were times when he did mention that the media should move to the side of an area and get out of the way. And many times the media didn't want to do that and made it kind of difficult, although he asked them to step away many times. He also said there were times when there were one-on-one interviews being done by some of the media who got extremely upset when somebody else came in and stuck a microphone in that interview too. Well, that's kind of the nature of the beast for all of us. If we see something going on and we want to get a piece of it, why not just jump right into their microphone? So that upsets some of the media. So there was some infighting with the media. We also, since we thought that we would not be able to get Captain Johnson to be with us today, we contacted the National Information Officers Association, which handles police information people. And just a few days ago, they sent us a note saying they were honored by our invitation to be here, but after discussion with the board, we feel that this event has not had the appropriate amount of time to ripen. Our participation in this type of panel discussion is premature, while too many unanswered questions remain. So we tried to get someone from law enforcement to be here, and they respectfully declined until things cool off and they figure out where they are and what's going on with them. So that's why we don't have anybody from the law enforcement. Are there any other people in the room, by the way, just hold up your hands, who were on West Florissant Avenue while all of this was going on? We went over.
I personally wasn't, but several of my co-workers were.
Okay.
And a couple of them sent me accounts.
From St. Louis Public Radio. Well, we could stand up here and kick this around because it's an interesting topic and we can talk shop up here all day. But we know some of you might have some questions. If you have some questions you'd like to ask the panelists, feel free to step to the microphone right here and ask any questions that you have. We have a room full of journalists with oh, good. Okay, we do have a journalist with a question. Yes, sir.
My question is for Robert. He's actually a coworker of mine. So, can you just talk a little bit about, you're in St. Louis, you're stationed there, you're there every day. When things aren't going on, you're still there. So can you talk about a little bit about, how you felt when you had this rush of media and rush of people who weren't from St. Louis, kind of there and, occupying it, for lack of a better term?
Sure. To be honest, it was a shock, number one, but the truth to be told, like once it kind of hit what happened, or hit that everybody was there. Before I was in St. Louis, I lived in New York for about 8 years in like the freelancing world, and I honestly felt like I was back in New York, like literally, like it was just that frequent, just the amount of just activity that was taking place, you just couldn't sleep, or at least in my case, I couldn't sleep. There were emails going out for me probably at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. I was getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, at 5 to, do reports or send things over, constantly being in contact with everyone from a local standpoint to a national standpoint, trying to keep up to speed with all the events. I mean, we're talking about a situation where it seemed like everybody wanted to have some form of rally or protest. And I don't say that as a joke, but I mean, it was literally like that. Like you literally would have a rally conclude at like 10 a.m. and literally at 10:05 you get an email that another one's about to start up at 11 a.m. that just got prompted like over Twitter. As soon as that one wrapped up, here comes another one. It's a fundraiser. There was just something, especially that very first week. It was just like so I'm like, how do you cover all these? How do you verify which ones make sense, which ones don't to cover? It was, I would say like from a cover standpoint, it was. And I say this, and I don't want to come across the wrong way. It's kind of like a rush in some ways because like it was just not normal, to see something like that take place in St. Louis. But I say that like carefully only because it was a tragedy, which this happened as a result. And regardless of how you look at it, it was a tragedy for the fact that many people were negatively affected by this, And so my answer to that was just like it. When I saw him come in, it was like, okay, here we go. That's really the way it was. It's like either you are ready to move when something like that happens, whether you have a plan or not, or you just sit back and you stand still and just let someone else, take over, And so you just gotta be ready, period. And so when it was time to it was game time, I really, honestly, Blau, I didn't even think about it. It was just kind of like, let's go, so.
This question is for the panel. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I've been following this story basically since the shooting happened on that Saturday. How was it, afternoon, maybe? But it seemed to me, from my perspective, that journalists on the scene kind of became like weather men and women, describing the social climate of what's been going on. And it seemed to me that the storytelling aspect really took a hit. I think one example of that is the hashtag "If They Gun Me Down," where people were tweeting pictures of themselves based upon photos that the media were broadcasting of Michael Brown, kind of looking a little bit questionable, I'll say, and people were tweeting that with the hashtag "If They Gun Me Down," photos of themselves maybe in some baggy clothes, and then right next to it a photo of them playing with their child or in a military uniform. I'm just wondering what the panel's thoughts were. I know, Robert, you touched on it a little bit when you talked about how difficult it was to get people to come forward, but...
So what are you asking? I guess, so you're saying that if They Gun Me Down and covering what was happening on a hashtag was not good narrative storytelling?
I'm saying that it just seemed to me that a lot of the majority of the coverage was all about the protests and what was going on, as in terms of maybe some of the residents, their feelings, their stories of having lived there, having interacted with police, didn't get as much. I'm not saying that it didn't get coverage, but it didn't get as much coverage, if that clears things up.
Sure. Mike. Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I can answer that one because I know exactly what you're saying. And I can actually speak on that in relation to Interactive One, because what you just mentioned was a primary issue of mine when it took place, because there were certain, in my personal opinion, perspectives that were being kind of promoted out there, or certain messages that are being lost as to what was really taking place, what was really important about what was going on. Not to anybody's fault per se, but it just was happening. And so when we started to gear up on our side, on the Radio 1 side, with the coverage that we did, we were kind of in a very unique position because me being part of the Interactive One side. Obviously with Interactive, you're dealing with digital, and digital encompasses more than just, pictures. You're dealing with pictures, you're dealing with audio, you're dealing with video, you're dealing with text. It ended up becoming the goal was to pretty much create a hub of content that all of our entities could actually pull from. But at that point, it was still like, okay, we're gonna get all this content, but what's the focus? And the focus literally became the stories that you just mentioned were being ignored or not being focused on as much. And so outside of like having individuals from the community be the voices, who are out there from a contract standpoint, we made it our goal to get the voices in the work in the opinions and perspective of individuals of the community who did not have to be, figureheads about how they felt, what was going on, what was taking place. We had a video, and out of all the videos we shot, was probably like my favorite one. It was my second favorite one. Was the mother of Michael Brown at one point, in the midst of all the stuff, decided to just go back to where her son got shot. And she was just there by herself. My reporter caught her. She had like no security around her. There was no police around her. There was only like 2 or 3 reporters who were just there. And she was just standing there. She just wanted to be with the community and just talk to people, and she outright said it, I'm just here. I just want to be around my community. And then if you looked in the street, you saw literally a line of just roses. People just taking rose petals and roses themselves and literally just went all, like right in the center of the street, just had them all the way, it was going all the way down. People would literally just drive by, drop a rose, and just keep it going. I've never seen anything like that before. And it was one of those things that from a story standpoint, I didn't see too much coverage. Actually, I didn't see any coverage of that. And so it was like, all right, these are the things that we, as a news entity, we can actually get out there. And we felt, as you mentioned, that was something that was very important to present, because even from being in St. Louis, I can tell you that a lot of individuals in St. Louis were not happy about how St. Louis is being promoted, on a national level. It was like we're being shown as a war zone, so yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Next.
Greg, I appreciated your comment about the difference between before September 11th and after September 11th. I think we've all seen security measures and things like that change. Curious as to where you think we can go in reminding authorities and police we're the good guys. Now, we should all be on our best behavior. Probably in that situation, everybody wasn't in regards to the media. However, when you think about it, if they continue to do this kind of thing, take it back to 1963. If a civil rights movement had been banned for the media coverage, we wouldn't have the I Have a Dream speech on videotape or film today. It would be lost to history. So it's concerning to hear that, yes, it's a different day, and yes, it's hard to discern all reporters today, but when you see the video of Al Jazeera, it's pretty clear they knew who they were. No doubt, that was a TV crew. So just curious what you think as far as how do you stop this or remind them that, you know, we're there for a better reason.
Well, you know, it's difficult because you say, how do we convince them that we're the good guys? Well, first you have to tell them who we are. So it does get back to that issue of, you know, who is a journalist who is there to try to objectively cover an incident versus who is an activist trying to promote a cause. And many journalists, you know, write for opinion blogs or for opinion pages. So the line is even harder to draw. And we've just got to continue having discussions about how to draw that line. And then I think, you know, with Ferguson, we really are now getting the first inklings that there's going to be more attention paid to this idea of the militarization of police and stepping back from that. And I think one of the ways, if they're serious nationwide about changing the police image from something like you saw here, you know, what they're going to have to do is really make an effort to reinstitute those practices that worked. And those primarily include getting journalists, allowing journalists to cover something openly. And again, I got to, you know, stress as much as possible, allowing accurate information to get out there, both releasing it themselves and not interfering with journalists getting it, is going to be critical. And so, you know, as the Justice Department intervenes and, you know, they're not acting like a judge determining who's guilty in Ferguson. They're going to try to implement a plan, as I understand it, you know, to say how police should react in these situations. And so as part of that plan, you know, there's got to be more discussion of allowing journalists back in, trusting journalists. And I think that's where we've really got to concentrate our efforts.
In the handout material that we have over here, there's 30 copies, so we'll post it on the internet later. But there's an article from Pointer about 5 lessons the St. Louis Post-Dispatch learned about covering things in Ferguson. And there's a bunch of other things that are critical as well as helpful too in that material.
A brief disclaimer, I work for St. Louis Public Radio, but I'm the only reporter that did not spend time at some point in Ferguson. I'm their state capitol reporter. My perspective was covering our governor's response to what was going on in Ferguson and his the nearly week it took him to start spending more time there and addressing issues. If it's okay, I have some very brief accounts from 2 of my coworkers who were on the ground in Ferguson, and I'd like to hear your responses or thoughts on what they observed. First is Dury Buscarin. This is what she wrote, and I will be brief. What struck me were the ethics of having a press staging area. Essentially, they had media stay within a cordoned-off parking lot to cover the riot without risking arrest. It didn't feel right to me because I've always been taught that it's unethical to give media special treatment of any form. Separating media and protesters meant they could use crowd control methods, rubber bullets, tear gas arrests on the public without the risk of hitting journalists. Stephanie and I chose to stay with the protesters but left when we heard bullets coming from the crowd and couldn't immediately identify the shooters. We did not have bulletproof vests at that point. Had there not been other reporters and photographers there to document the rest of the evening, I'm not sure what we would have done. The other account is from Rachel Lippman. Hers is I found this one rather very interesting. On the last night I was there, which would have been the 21st, I believe, I did notice that the group that was marching rather than just watching would make sure to stop for 30 seconds or so in front of Anderson Cooper's set near the public storage building just to give their time in front of the TV cameras. When NBC and CNN packed it in, the crowd dwindled pretty quickly. Saw the same phenomenon over the Powell shooting in the city of St. Louis. When the cameras would turn on, people would start chanting, but when the camera's lights clicked off, they'd go pretty quiet. Playing to the cameras definitely became a thing. Just my question is, your thoughts on those two accounts, and did you see similar things?
So those are, those are two very different, obviously, thematic points. The first is about the media staging area, or what I called the pen earlier, just because there was one that was kind of in a parking lot that was gated, so it did feel kind of like a pen. And I will say that what Dury and Stephanie were able to do is not be in it, so it wasn't as if you couldn't move completely. It wasn't completely inflexible to get in and out of the pen. But other journalists had different experiences. So again, I have to emphasize that. Police, and I guess you can talk to their legal questions, Greg, but police are most of the time within their rights to create barricades. I mean, how many of us have covered crime scenes, right, and not been able to duck under the crime scene tape to get better footage? That does happen, and like you said, the courts have not explicitly said that the First Amendment protects news gathering, but instead protects news communication, right? So, Greg, where do you fall on the staging areas? Because again, they don't give us special privileges, but they also shouldn't give us special areas in those cases.
Yeah. There is definitely constitutional protection for news gathering. It's just that there are no bright lines. Police can't do something unreasonable in the circumstances. Once you start throwing those kind of qualifiers into a legal test, it just means you have to, it has to be subject to interpretation every time it comes up. Those pens, we can thank both the U.S. Secret Service and the New York Police Departments for really deciding that those were the way to go. The Secret Service is obviously in charge of security at presidential inaugurations and the conventions, the political conventions. And so they came up with the ideas years ago, again, post 9/11, to create these pens for both protesters and the media. They decided they could regulate speech to that degree, and they got away with it only because they clamped down on the whole area around a convention site and said every step of this area is something that we have to secure. So again, that's kind of constantly part of the dialogue, because when there was a political convention in New York City, they really got out of hand. They made these pens out of that orange snow fencing and literally crammed people in, and made it impossible to cover a story. The same thing happened with the Occupy movement in downtown Manhattan. They tried to pen the journalists in, and they put the journalists further away than the general public could have seen the incident. And so, in a sense, doing stupid things like that helps make it obvious that they've gone too far. And so New York has gotten a little better, the Secret Service has gotten a little better, and we've got to make that part of the dialogue here, too.
And we should point out, it's not just during protests and potential unrest that these pens happen. During presidential campaigns, the traveling press corps, the ones that are at every speech, every stump speech, and follow around the president, often complain that they are more penned in than the local journalists who get to be on the ground and among the crowd, because a lot of the presidential traveling press corps is not able to get out and actually do more on-the-ground reporting. So if we are going to fight for more access and more rights, it shouldn't just happen in covering protest situations. It should be in all situations.
We're out of time, I think. We might have time for one more quick question.
Okay.
Make it real quick.
Make it real quick.
Make your answers real quick.
So sort of similar to what he was saying about journalistic ethics in general, issues like, incidents like this, and I can also think of like the Trayvon Martin case, it becomes a very polarized national discussion. And in that, like, if, you know, like if Michael Brown was innocent, then it is a racial issue, and then if the cop was in the right, you know, to be protecting himself, then it wasn't a racial issue. What, you know, when you're covering this, what responsibility as a journalist do you have to sort of, you know, get into all the details and give people, you know, everything that they can possibly know, or take a step back and really try and give people the broader story?
I can just answer that really quick on my side. The answer to that is, to me, is our responsibility to report the news itself, not to express an opinion. When it comes to it, give the hardcore facts and come from a non-biased perspective. I think that's pretty much, at least for me, that's the most important thing that you can do, you know, and give an honest retrospective of what's happening. So.
Can we get one more question in, please?
You have quick follow-up?
Just a quick question. We talked a lot about police hampering media operations. What about the other side? What about the criticism of the media itself? Can you address that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, there was, I've got to find, there was an Al Jazeera journalist named Brian Schuessler who, the night after Nellie showed up at the protests, which, you know, made it seem like the story was really becoming a spectacle, he wrote about how he wasn't going to return to Ferguson because he observed all of these things, you know, cameramen yelling at community leaders for stepping away from the podium, journalists making this story about them. One reporter who, last night, said he came to Ferguson as a, quote, networking opportunity. And so, so yes, there, again, in the case, just as there were bad actors among the protesters and bad actors among the police, there's probably no question that there were a few bad actors among the journalists. By the time I left, and I asked to leave because it was such, you know, it was like dog days being in Ferguson. You know, one day was like 7 days. And so, but by the time I actually left, which was fully 2 weeks after Michael Brown was shot, there was a lot of international press there. There were Turkish media and Austrian media, German media, and they had come with their gas masks and flak jackets, like expecting and almost looking for things to go wrong and perhaps portray like, this is what's happening on the streets of America. And so, so there was certainly no question that towards the end of the big cycle, there were a lot of more opportunistic journalists, but I still think it was a small percentage of the bigger whole. I think generally the folks that I met were exceedingly professional and were trying to get to the context of the situation as well as they could.
The Ferguson story is not yet done. The Ferguson story still has at least one more major chapter, and that's when the grand jury comes into the report and the follow-up of what occurs there. But this is an ongoing story in St. Louis County, where Ferguson is one of about 90 communities, and about 30 of these communities have police departments that don't look anything like the population of the town. There have been great social issues raised in Ferguson, not just police protesters issues, but a lot of other social issues that have been raised. So this story is going to be going on and on for some time. Next year, perhaps, we'll have a greater understanding and a greater perspective on how all of this plays out, and probably, Robert, you and Elise might be back on the streets of Ferguson before this is done. And so perhaps next year we need to have another one of these discussions that not only gets into some of the things we've been talking about, but what the lessons really are long-term that we learned from Ferguson about covering things in situations like this, about being prepared for covering things like this, not just street riots, but major storms and tornadoes that devastate part of your town. There are a lot of similarities. So thank you very much to our three panelists, Greg and Robert and Elise, and thank you very much for being here, and let's go to our next session. Thank you.